Have you ever struggled with pride? Do you try to put others first, but ultimately end up doing things that make you feel selfish? Well, it may not surprise you that there once was an empire built on the idea of pride, and that thought humility was the most shameful thing anyone could ever be. Join me as we discover in this episode how that same idea of humility fundamentally changed this empire, and how it can change your life as well. Imagine with me, if you will, that you live in a small city in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. Not only that, you are a man, a male citizen of the empire. It may seem like a small difference, but I assure you it will come back. It may not seem like much, but trust me, the idea that you're a man is a big deal, because the thing is, you are not a Roman by birth. You're actually Greek, but you became a Roman citizen through your military service. You served in the army, and you're what is known as a foederati, a non-Roman citizen who gained their citizenship through military service to the empire. And once upon a time, you actually were an enemy of Rome, but you and your people were absorbed into the empire, and this new citizen status that you have, it suits you pretty well, because as a citizen, you enjoy all of the benefits of being a legally recognized person in the empire. And as a man, you have the rights to a fully legalized marriage. Under this law, any woman who marries you falls under your protection. Any possessions or any property that she might have when she marries you legally becomes yours by right. It's a pretty sweet deal, for you at least. Any children that you have with your new wife in such a marriage union would also be legal citizens when they are born, just like you. However, as a dad, as a father, you also have a legal right to execution. That's right. It may seem a little bit bizarre, but legally, as a father, you have the right to execute any of your children at any time for any reason. You've never put this into practice, but you could if you wanted to. This is just what it means to be part of the empire. But the potentially most important part of Roman citizenship is the protection that legal citizenship affords you. Because as a Roman citizen, it is illegal for any Roman authority to scourge you, to whip you, or to torture you. It is illegal. You are protected under the law from such harsh punishments. You can be executed if you commit, for instance, treason, but if you are sentenced to death as a citizen, you also have the right to elect to choose a self-appointed exile instead, saving your skin in the process. But the other thing that being a full citizen allows you is protection from the worst kind of death. And that is, of course, crucifixion, that any person can go through in the Roman Empire. And as a Roman citizen, you have seen many an execution in your time. You know what it's like to see somebody hanging on a cross, sometimes for days on end, slowly dying of asphyxiation, painfully, as wild animals peck at them, as crowds mock them and throw things at them, slowly dying that agonizing death. There is nothing in the empire more humiliating and more shaming than crucifixion. And as a citizen, you are legally protected from this abominable form of execution. But these rights aren't just rights and privileges. They tell a story about who you are and what your place in this world is. Because as a Roman citizen, a new member of the empire, you have now bought into the greater story of Rome and the empire that it created. It's a story that goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, there lived two brothers named Romulus and Remus. Their father was Mars, the god of war himself, and your mother was an exiled princess named Rhea Silvia. After their birth, the tyrannical king Amulius saw these two little boys as a threat to his rule, to his kingdom, and so he ordered that they be cast out into the world and left to die by exposure by the side of the river Tiber. Famously, they were found and nursed back to health by a wolf, and eventually they were adopted by a local shepherd in the area. Over time, these two little boys grew up and they became renowned warriors. And eventually, these two warrior brothers discovered their secret heritage and they went on to a great adventure that we don't have time for today. But tragically, when these two brothers returned home from their adventure, they decided to build a city for themselves. And in this decision, disaster struck. Romulus and Remus, they disagreed over which hill to establish this new city on. And so as they argued together, eventually Romulus got so angry that he killed his brother Remus. And after he killed his brother, he went on to create the city of Rome and became its very first king. And this is the story of Rome. It's a story of intrigue, of blood and betrayal. It's a story of conquest. It's a story of might over right. And it's a story about one people group asserting their dominance over every other people group. Now, as a citizen of the empire, this is also your story. You didn't begin in the empire, and you may not necessarily believe all of it to be true, but as a citizen, you believe it and you tell it, and what you do believe in is the message behind the story. Because the emphasis on the story of Rome is the story of honor and shame. This is very core to you as a person and to the empire. To be a citizen of Rome is to avoid this humiliation, to avoid things like slavery, torture, crucifixion. And the worst is that last one, crucifixion. Such a death would bring incredible shame on not only you, but your family too. Because at the end of the day, pride is what matters to you and to your people. And also, it's about bloody conquest. It's about might making right. And it's the need to prove that you, the Roman people, are superior over every other people group. To have pride is to have security. It's to have wealth. It's to have a good standing in society. If you were humiliated, if you were shamed, it not only shamed you, but it shamed your family, anyone that you came into contact with, your business partners, your employees. Shame and honor was the dichotomy, was the yin and the yang, the high and the low that this society operated on. Shame was the worst thing that you could suffer. And so as a Roman, you would do everything in your power to avoid shame and humiliation. Romans simply believed that they were better than everyone else, which is why pride is such a big thing in their culture. Because what I haven't mentioned so far is the fact that in the empire, women weren't allowed to be citizens, at least not like men. Yes, they had a limited form of citizenship, but if they ever married, they were essentially treated like property. Remember what I said before, if you were a woman and you married a Roman citizen, everything that you owned legally became his. Also, slaves and foreigners, but particularly slaves, had no rights at all. They could never become a citizen. As one scholar later remarked, The slave has no personality. He does not own his body. He has no ancestors, no name, no goods of his own. To be a slave in the empire, which, by the way, was most people living in the empire were slaves, whether they came from a different part of Italy or a different part of the world. Rome's entire empire was built off the back of slavery. In fact, scholars today agree that if it were not for the slaves of Rome, the empire would never have been what it was. And so, life was pretty good in the empire, at least if you were a citizen, at least for those who were in charge. That is, of course, unless you were a child, a woman, a slave, or a foreigner. Everybody else had better get in line, otherwise they risked being trampled underneath the imperial boot. But after all, who was going to argue with Rome? It was the largest, wealthiest, most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Before the Romans came the Greeks, and before them the Persians, and before them the Babylonians, and before them the Assyrians, but Rome now conquered and ruled all of the lands that all of those people had ever ruled. It had destroyed entire nations, killed millions of people, and enslaved millions more. What could possibly destabilize the greatest superpower the world had ever known? And yet, in an obscure little corner of the empire, in a little backwater country named Judea, a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, and his followers were growing a movement, a grassroots against the political system, against the religious system movement, that its ideals would go on to destabilize even this empire. See, when the Jesus movement came onto the scene, its very existence was a challenge to the standards of the day, not just of the empire, but of the agreed upon ethical standards of everyday people. Because even Jesus's followers expected Jesus to be like the kings and the emperors of the day. They expected him to be like Romulus, like Remus, to be bloodthirsty conquerors, to take back Jerusalem and the country, to kick the Romans out and to conquer. But Jesus was unlike any king, unlike any emperor that anyone had ever seen. Because when Jesus preached, he spoke of a kingdom that was not coming, but that was already here. And in this kingdom, Jesus preached that the first would be last and the last would be first. In this kingdom, the highest ideal of moral character would be to simply trust like a child. In this kingdom, citizens are mandated to love foreigners, to love those who hate them, to pray for those who oppress them. Jesus reached out to women, to children, to foreigners, to people who were not accepted in polite society. He broke cultural norms, he broke spiritual norms, and he broke just about every other norm that you could possibly imagine. In all of the ways that Rome elevated its citizens to feel better about themselves, to elevate their pride, to make them feel like they were superior to women, to children, to slaves, to foreigners, Jesus broke that ideal apart in the way that he preached, in the way that he taught, but most importantly, in the way that he acted. When he reached out to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, he was breaking not only gender norms, but cultural norms. To talk to a woman and talk to a Sumerian woman was taboo. To tell the little children to come to him and not to let them be driven away was to put value on children who were little more than property. And to continually reach out to the sick, to the wounded, to the outcast in society, Jesus was telling the world a different story. He was telling the story of humility. Humility rather than pride was the way that Jesus operated in the world. And it was the way that he preached and taught that somebody would attain and maintain the most amount of power. Years later, after Jesus' death and his resurrection and his ascension to heaven, the Apostle Paul, an early church leader, is writing to a group of Jesus followers living in the city of Colossae. He's encouraging them to live in the way of Jesus and to reject the way the world wields power. This is what he says in Colossians 2, verse 8 to 10 and 13 to 15. He says this, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. For in him, Jesus, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have come to fullness in him, who is the head of every ruler and every authority. And when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive, together with him, and he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set this aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and the authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it." Here Paul is drawing on a multitude of word images and concepts that these early Christians would have been very familiar with. It seems a little bit alien to us. This is not the way that we speak, but to these early Christians, this would have been familiar language because these people were living in a time and a place kind of like our own, actually. They lived in a spiritually pluralistic society. In other words, they were surrounded by many different types of people practicing many different types of faiths. And Paul is saying here, a lot of people around you are going to try and lead you astray, lead you this way and that way, with all sorts of philosophical discussions and wise sayings which, on the surface, might seem right and correct and interesting, but underneath, they're actually deceptive. So, don't fall prey to these teachings because ultimately, they are trying to enslave you. Slavery and freedom is a big theme with Paul and with Jesus. The idea that when we give ourselves to other things, when we give ourselves to empty philosophical ideas, things that might seem attractive and yet actually are not, it's a form of slavery. Paul talks a lot about being a slave to Christ or a slave to righteousness, which just means who are you giving your allegiance to? He then finishes this section with this really curious phrase. Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. And that should make us pause and wonder, what rulers and authorities is he talking about here? What Paul is talking about is the way that he sees the world. He doesn't see the world in terms of vague moralistic ideas, but in terms of actual entities and beings who are working behind the scenes to make their will come to pass on earth as it is in their realm. So in this passage, Paul is saying, when Jesus died on the cross, something happened in the spiritual realm, the realm that we cannot touch and we cannot see with our five senses. Something happened there that can now be felt in the physical world. In the ancient world and in cultures much like the ones in which Paul was writing, if a king conquered another king, he would take the spoils and the booty and the treasures of that particular kingdom, and he would also take the royal family, nobles, notable people from that kingdom, and he would take them through the city streets of his capital city, parading them for everyone to see. And this was an incredible act of shame. This was an incredible act of humiliation. And the Romans were very familiar with this tactic. This is what they did. Whenever they conquered a people group or a nation, they would lead the captive conquered person through the city streets. There's a very famous story about Julius Caesar going to war with the Gauls in France. And after years and years and years of battles, he captures the Gaulish leader and he takes him all the way from northern France down to Rome. He kills everybody else, virtually, but he takes this one Gaul leader all the way from northern France, all the way down to Rome, parades him through the city streets, shows off what he has done, elevates himself, gives himself and his soldiers all of the honor and the praise and the adoration, saying, look what I have done, and look at this man, look at how he tried to defy Rome. And only then does he execute him. This is the MO for people like this. They're saying, I'm stronger, my gods are stronger, my people are stronger. And I'm showing it off by making you, who was a king, who was a leader, into my slave. It was done to humiliate, to embarrass, and to shame the loser, and to deter any would-be rivals from messing with the conquering king. And this is the image that Paul is painting of Jesus. Jesus is the conquering king. When he died on the cross, Paul is saying that he disarmed, he took the weapons of the spiritual powers behind the scenes who are manipulating the world according to their own plans and their own ideas. He disarmed them and led them through the street as a humiliation. What an inversion. The cross, crucifixion, the instrument of ultimate shame, of ultimate humility, becomes the instrument of ultimate exaltation, of ultimate honor. Jesus' death on the cross, which was seen as a death only fit for the worst of criminals and betrayers, becomes the throne upon which he is coronated. The crown of thorns that is also meant to humiliate him becomes the crown that would go on to be a symbol of Jesus forever. The cross which now we wear around our necks and which we have emblazoned in our churches went from being a symbol of humility and of dishonor becomes the ultimate symbol of triumph and victory. Because remember what we said about crucifixion. To a first century person, the cross was this symbol of humiliation and shame. The victim would have been stripped naked and whipped, and then after being nailed to the cross, they died slowly, agonizingly, without any dignity and respect over the course, in many cases, of a few days. And crowds gathered and they were encouraged to mock the victims, throw rotten food at them, and to generally do anything and everything possible to make them as shamed and humiliated as possible. And what Paul is doing here, and what Jesus is doing here, is genius. And to understand it, we really need to understand what Paul said earlier in his letter to the Colossians. Colossians 1 verse 15 to 20 says, He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. What Paul is saying is this: Jesus went through the most painful, humiliating death possible, and it was exactly that act that elevated him to being the preeminent being over all creation. Paul is flipping the script on us by showing us that it's not emperors, it's not kings that hold true power, the ones who hold the power of life and death over their citizens. No. True power is laying down your own life in the service of others. True power is not in how I can exert my influence or my authority over others for my benefit, but how much I can lay down myself for other people. I love what Simon Sinek says in his book, Leaders Eat Last. He says, you can easily judge the character of a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. The story of Rome is the story of pride, self-exaltation, and selfishness. The story of Jesus' kingdom is of humility, selfless service, and others-centeredness. So much so that he became a human, lived and died for you and me. And so my question for you today is, which story do you want to tell of your life and in your life? Are you satisfied with thinking only of yourself? Or does it leave you feeling empty and hollow? Have you pushed others around, trying to get your own way? And if so, what has it left you with? The invitation for each of us is about which kingdom we want to belong to, which kingdom we want to live in. Because the story of Rome, even though the Roman Empire is gone, is still very much alive and well today. The path of Jesus' kingdom is difficult. Putting others first, laying down your life for those around you, loving those who mistreat you, it's tough. And like Jesus, you might end up getting abused for it. But I tell you what, the story of the kingdom of God is far better than the story of Rome. Humility and self-sacrifice is a pathway to love, generosity, and the peace that passes all understanding. The only question that remains is, which kingdom do you want to live in? Which story do you want to be told of your life? The kingdom of earth, the kingdom of Rome, or the kingdom of heaven? The choice today is yours.